Okay, hi everyone. How you doing? I'm doing another for my second channel fun little video. Well, it's going to be a little more serious. I'm going to be doing instead of a watch with me, I'm going to do a read with me. Today I want to read with you a chapter from the book A Fortress in Brooklyn. The reason I had the idea to do that is because I'm rereading this book now. I'm also thinking about the bike lane, which is being revamped in Williamsburg right now, and I'm working on content around that. And I thought, this is a really good overview on the story of the bike lane. And for those who are interested in the story as it is, as it's been written down in this book, it's worth it for me to do a bit of a reading from it. So I'm going to be reading the chapter 9, Two-Way Street. Never done a reading before, so I'm kind of excited. In cities around the world, one of the most common and controversial spatial transformations that accompanied gentrification during the first decades of the 21st century was the construction of bike lanes. Like gentrifying neighborhoods in Portland, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and other cities during this period, Williamsburg was no exception. What was different, however, was the presence of the large Hasidic community in South Williamsburg, an area that linked gentrifying areas to the south, Clinton Hill, Fort Greene, Bedford Stuyvesant, Dumbo, with those to the north, North Williamsburg, Greenpoint, and that included a crucial segment of the rapidly developing Brooklyn waterfront. Beginning in 2004, the city held a series of public workshops to discuss the development of a greenway along the Brooklyn waterfront. The following year, the rezoning of the Williamsburg Greenpoint section of the waterfront set the stage for the construction of bike lanes on several of the main arteries that traverse the Hasidic enclave. Once installed, the bike lanes were a stark reminder that the traditional borders of Hasidic Williamsburg had been breached, and in practical terms, they served as a conduit for the daily passage of numerous riders through the neighborhood. The ensuing controversy and the sensationalist media coverage it inspired, I like that they are able to see through this, revealed unique features of what took place in Hasidic Williamsburg while also illuminating important parallels with other gentrifying neighborhoods in the city, as well as around the country where the creation of bike lanes provoked conflict between longtime residents and newcomers. By the way, A Fortress in Brooklyn was written by Nathaniel Deutsch and Michael Casper. It is probably the single best work, in my opinion, on Hasidic Judaism, contemporary Hasidic Judaism from an academic perspective altogether. Um, I have been told that it's very academic, but it is written by two academics, and I have found it to be so on point. I feel like they call out the media so effectively. I really love this book for how insightful it is. For decades, the Satmar community has sought to regulate and, in certain contexts, prohibit bike riding by its members. According to one Hasidic source, when asked about the subject in the 1970s by one of his followers, Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum had expressly prohibited Satmar children from riding bicycles to and from school. I grew up knowing that a bicycle is a shaigetz bike, which is like a shiksa bike in male gender terms, so it was like a negative thing. And we weren't allowed to ride it. Definitely not girls, but boys of Satmar, neither. Other sects, I think the boys will ride bicycles. Yet, unlike ball playing, which he also sought to limit, and by the way, in some ways we all played ball, bicycling was not, and I've never heard of him trying to limit ball playing except organized sports. So this is news to me. Bicycling was not only a leisure activity, but also an important mode of transportation, one that could easily have been adopted by Hasidim in Williamsburg for practical reasons. The vast majority of Hasidic residents of the neighborhood, unlike those in the Hasidic enclave in Antwerp, Belgium, rejected bicycling for transportation. Instead, over the years, the Hasidic community in Williamsburg developed a pervasive and entrenched culture of driving automobiles. The reason for this included the typically large number of children in Hasidic families, which encouraged the use of minivans, SUVs, and in an earlier generation, station wagons. All of these children attended private religious schools, which relied on fleets of yellow school buses of yellow buses to shuttle them back and forth. The extensive family and business ties between Hasidim in Williamsburg and those in other neighborhoods in Brooklyn, as well as in communities such as Kiryas Joel, New Square, New York, or Lakewood Township, New Jersey, meant that Hasidic residents of the neighborhood relied on their own vehicles or on private buses to attend weddings and other functions, to travel to bungalows during the summer, to commute to work, and so on. In addition, many Hasidim avoided using subways either out of fear of crime, especially during the period of New York City's decline, or because they wanted to avoid crowded mixed-gender settings and immodestly dressed riders. I do see Hasidim on the subways all the time, but I think taking the children on the subways is something people would prefer to avoid as much as possible. It's also, of course, so much more convenient to have the whole family go by car in one minivan. Long before city officials decided to install bike lanes in the neighborhood, therefore, many residents of Hasidic Williamsburg had developed a strong attachment to driving, one that reflected the community's distinctive character but was also shared by members of other working and middle-class urban neighborhoods across the United States. Where opposition to bike lanes crystallized during the same period. As the anthropologist Adonio Lugo observed in regard to a bitter conflict over bike lanes in a traditional African American neighborhood in Washington, D.C., access to driving is seen as a very important status symbol in such communities. Sometimes people feel threatened when they feel a bike lane project will reduce their access to driving, which, by the way, is what I heard today in Hasidic Williamsburg. I was trying to get oral testimonies of how people feel about the renovated bike lane, and they feel like it's causing more congestion. That's one of the complaints I was hearing. Sometimes people feel threatened when they feel a bike lane project will reduce their access to driving. It is important to keep this broader context in mind as we examine how the Williamsburg bike lane battle unfolded and was represented in the media. By the time Mayor Bloomberg appointed Jeanette Sadik-Khan to be New York City's new Department of Transportation commissioner in 2007, bike lanes had been installed earlier in the year on White Avenue and Bedford Avenues, right in the heart of Hasidic Williamsburg. 6 years and hundreds of miles of bike lanes later, Bloomberg described Sadik-Khan as being like the child that Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs never had. These are two very iconic New York City figures who were seen to have very opposing urban development visions. An urban visionary determined to reshape the streets of New York, but with an abiding concern for the health of neighborhoods and the safety of their residents. By contrast, critics of her ambitious bike lane program accused her of overreach. John Cassidy, a writer for The New Yorker, even compared her to Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just, and Bloomberg to Maximilien Robespierre, the French revolutionaries who led the Terror. Almost immediately after being appointed commissioner, Sadik-Khan turned her attention to the Williamsburg waterfront, whose landmark rezoning in 2005 had made possible the construction of high-rise luxury development in an area previously notable for its factories and warehouses, Hasidic education institutions, the cavernous used clothing emporium Domzi's, the Italian restaurant Giando, and, once the sun went down, sex workers who plied their trade in the shadow of the Williamsburg Bridge. Running through this changing landscape was Kent Avenue, long used as a truck route. It was there that Sadik-Khan sought to install what she described in her memoir, a bike lane, as a bike superhighway connecting with Dumbo, Fort Greene, and Greenpoint. A local link in a biking greenway that one day will link neighborhoods along Brooklyn's 14-mile waterfront. This is very interesting to me. I bike here all the time. I bike on Kent Avenue. It's very beautiful. Biking, running, and Hasidim walking there by the waterfront. I absolutely love this piece of greenway. By the way, this is like my electronic copy of this book. I have no idea what I at one point highlighted. I didn't highlight it now for this reading. It's just been highlighted when I originally read it. In April 2008, representatives of the Department of Transportation presented this vision to Community Board 1 in Williamsburg Greenpoint, whose members voted 39-2 to approve construction of the greenway along the local waterfront, including a projected bike lane on Kent. Later that fall, as details of the proposed bike lane became public with the release of a concept plan for the greenway put together by planners at the Brooklyn Greenway Initiative and the Regional Plan Association, opponents of the Hasidic community expressed their concern at a meeting of Community Board 1 in September 2008. Media outlets focused on the community's objection to scantily clad riders biking through their neighborhood. A few days after the meeting, for example, the New York Post published an article on the brewing conflict, its provocative headline, Hasidic Lust Cause, reflecting a long-standing tendency in the media to highlight the sexual dimension of news stories involving the Hasidic community in Williamsburg. Of course, to some degree, this framing simply reflected the importance of sexual modesty among Hasidim and the attempted regulation of immodest dress and behavior by zealous members of the community. It is also a truism that sex sells, especially in the tabloid media, and most especially when it came to a highly insular religious community whose very modesty helped provoke sometimes lurid speculations by others. And yet, even the article in the Post indicated that sex was only one aspect of what was going on in Williamsburg. Hasidim expressed concern that bike lanes would cause parking problems, traffic congestion, and potentially dangerous conditions for the neighborhood's many children. And by the way, this is what I'm hearing now with a moving of the bike lane, which is already in the Hasidic community, in the newer part of the Hasidic community. So it's not an introduction of the bike lane, but just a moving of the bike lane in a way that makes the bike lane safer, but less so for the community itself. So people have not raised to me any objection to the bike lane on modesty grounds, but on safety grounds. So I think they're very right that the lust cause is just something we really like to write about. And it's a narrative that sticks, and once it sticks, there it is. The Post reported, Hasid said during a September 8th community board meeting that the lanes on Bedford and White Avenues should be eliminated if the neighborhood has to accept being part of the Greenway along Kent Avenue. In other words, Hasidim were suggesting a trade-off to the city. Our community will accept a bike lane on Kent Avenue, enabling you to achieve your vision of a Greenway, if you get rid of the bike lanes on Bedford and White, which go straight through the middle of our neighborhood. Later that same day, other media outlets published pieces riffing on the Post article with salacious headlines such as It's Hasids versus Haredis in South Williamsburg and Hipster Hadis Bicyclists versus Hasids in South Williamsburg. The latter piece, which appeared on the popular real estate blog Curb New York, prompted over 100 comments, most of which were highly critical of Williamsburg's Hasidic community, to say the least, and many of them expressing virulent, anti-Semitic views. Among other things, posters to the site referred to Hasidim as the Brooklyn Taliban and suggested that they be sent to Iran or back to Israel, describing them as smelly weirdos or freaks, mocked their clothing and their supposed propensity to solicit prostitutes, tranny hookers, and asked whether New York City should set up a gated community on the same order as the Warsaw Ghetto and see how the Sids like living there. Sids. In addition to a number of comments that critically compared Hasidim to burqa-wearing Muslims, one poster confessed that Hasidim were even scarier than the African-American Latino residents of East New York. South Williamsburg scares me more than East New York, and I'm white. Only a few posters to the site questioned the profound anti-Semitism in the comment section, with one arguing that since Hasidim were longtime residents of Williamsburg, they should have a greater say regarding its infrastructure than newcomers. Wow, so much racism and intolerance exhibited here. The Hasidic community has been in Williamsburg long before it was hip to be there. Please respect their right to have the neighborhood they want. After all, the Hasids are not moving into your neighborhood. We are moving into theirs. Comments on the article were closed after someone asked, is it possible that we could clone Hitler from some remaining DNA? Mainstream media coverage fanned these flames by focusing almost exclusively on the modesty issue and ignoring the ways in which Hasidic opposition to bike lanes was not merely a product of the community's particular religious outlook, but also a reflection of much broader social forces affecting neighborhoods around the city and the country at the time. Rather than portraying Hasidic Williamsburg as one of a group of urban communities that were resisting bike lanes for a variety of reasons, including their close association with gentrification, concerns over parking and safety, and the long-time reliance of community members on cars, the media tended to treat the neighborhood as a unique phenomenon and an outlier. I really like this about this book. It sees broader trends in urban development, and it situates the Hasidic community as a community that is dealing with gentrifying forces, which is exactly what's been happening there, with Williamsburg becoming rezoned and going from being a place where come nighttime there were all these sex workers under the bridge to being one of the most expensive places to live. Obviously, the local community is dealing with those issues of gentrification that are common for other communities, but usually when these other communities, minorities, working class communities, are affected by gentrification, their position is portrayed sympathetically. But when the Hasidim deal with gentrification, it's often portrayed negatively and in isolation of all other similar communities. And that I think this criticism is very, very correct. And yet, only 2 years before the bike lane controversy began in South Williamsburg, members of Community Board 2 in neighboring Clinton Hill and Fort Greene had voted to reject the construction of a bike lane. Anthony Abelli, a board member, dismissed cyclists as thugs on two wheels. Similarly, in the fall of 2008, just as the struggle was heating up in Williamsburg, the installation of a new bike lane on Grand Street in Manhattan prompted business owners in Little Italy and Chinatown to mobilize against it, prompting one publication to ask, will new Grand Street bike lane kill Little Italy? Within a few years, bike lane controversies had erupted elsewhere in the city, in Woodside, Queens, in Staten Island, where the city removed a lane after installing it, and in Park Slope, Brooklyn, which became the site of what Sadiq Khan later described as the biggest bike controversy of all, one that engaged some of New York City's most powerful figures on a highly public, bitter, and vitriolic battle. Therefore, while the Hasidic community's concern over immodesty was distinctive, in other respects, the opposition of some of its members to bike lanes resembled that of other communities in New York City, especially in the outer boroughs, as well as in other cities profoundly affected by gentrification in this period. In Washington, D.C., for example, some African American residents fought a series of planned bike lanes on the grounds that they would severely limit parking for churchgoers and thus, as the United House of Prayer complained to the District Department of Transportation, infringe upon its constitutionally protected right of religious freedom and equal protection of the laws. Significantly, Haredi media sources were as quick as their mainstream counterparts to cover the brewing bike lane controversy in Williamsburg. Vos Nayis, which is an online Hasidic or Orthodox media publication, published an article on the topic that inspired nearly 150 comments. Some posters to the site were highly critical of Hasidic activists for bringing up the issue of modesty at all, with one writing, "It was so stupid to bring up the modesty issue. This will backfire strongly. The safety issue was simply and politically correct. Do our spokespeople have heads?" By contrast, other comments focused on the pritzes, or licentiousness, that bike lanes would bring into the neighborhood. One commenter wrote, "Pedestrians can close their eyes or look away not to see this pritzes, but unfortunately, we the drivers have an obligation to see the road, so we are forced to see the pritzes of the hipsters, which is the lowest of the low." The supposed moral decline of Hasidic Williamsburg brought about by gentrification, either relative to its glorious past or to other Haredi communities, inspired a number of comments. Others stressed that Williamsburg was not Kiryas Joel, New Square, or Mei Sharim, which is a Hasidic neighborhood in Jerusalem. Spatially segregated and culturally homogeneous Haredi enclave where it is possible to regulate people's behavior. Several pointed out that bike lanes were simply a part of living in exile. This is ridiculous. We're in Gullus, in exile. Deal with it. Many posters on Vos Nayis framed the conflict in terms of rights. Some asked how Hasidim would feel if other residents of the city tried to make them conform to their own standards of dress, or as one put it, how would frum Orthodox people feel if others tried to regulate their dress in their neighborhoods? Sorry, in order to walk in this area, you must wear short shorts and no head covers. Your kippah, head covering, and long coats offend our values. The streets of New York belong to all people, and it's not our place to tell Goyim how to dress in public. End of story. If the bike lanes are unsafe, we can fight them on those grounds. Nothing else will work. Yet others argued that just as the hipsters had the right to lobby for bike lanes, so too did Williamsburg's longtime Hasidic residents have the right to oppose them. I live in Williamsburg, and I'm flabbergasted on many of the above comments. Yes, hipsters have the same rights as us, but the lanes don't have to pass in the center of our neighborhood. Let it pass on the outskirts. It's really interesting to see the diversity of opinions. This is like reflects what I hear in reality. A few posters praised Hasidic activists such as Isaac Abram and Shimon Weiser, a member of Community Board 1, for organizing public opposition to the bike lanes, but others attributed the presence of bike lanes to the failure of Hasidic leaders who had squandered precious time and energy on infighting when they should have been confronting this plague on us called hipsters. Some posters bitterly criticized their fellow Hasidim for selling out to the gentrifiers and only afterwards complaining about their immoral behavior. First, all the people rented all their vacant apartments to the yuppies, and they didn't care to rent it to their poor brothers. Now there is the outcry, oy vey tznius, oy vey modesty. Other posters predicted eventually the entire Williamsburg will be sold to the hipsters because at some point we will have no choice but to move out. This thankfully did not happen. The existential threat posed by gentrification to the Hasidic community in Williamsburg was stressed by a poster who wrote, "The hipsters are the ones dictating what in our community should be." I actually did some research as to who these hipsters are and was surprised to find that many who live in Williamsburg are quite powerful people. Some are editors of magazines, famous artists, and children of the privileged of America. Williamsburg's leaders have no clue who they are up against. I, a Pashto Yid, a simple Jew, cannot confront its leaders. That's why I'm crying out here. The range of these responses reflect the range of Hasidic positions on bike lanes in Williamsburg. Some community members view the bike lanes as an additional sign of the moral decline of the neighborhood spurred on by gentrification. Others were more concerned with the economic impact of gentrification than with its moral dimensions, and still others viewed the bike lanes as just another consequence of living in exile or of living in the United States, where the same laws that protected the rights of bike lane advocates also enabled Jews to practice their religion with a kind of freedom they had never enjoyed elsewhere. Like the bike lanes themselves, the emergence of Usisnais and other Haredi-run websites, despite the ongoing attempts of community leaders to ban or severely limit internet usage in general, and these websites in particular, was a sign of how the virtual walls between Hasidim and Williamsburg and the outside world became both more porous and more difficult to police in the first decade of the 2000s. Nevertheless, this new reality did not stop the Hasidic establishment of the neighborhood from seeking to articulate an ideologically coherent and practically effective strategy for dealing with the bike lanes, as it had done regarding many other issues affecting the community for decades. Thus, a week after the story of the bike lane controversy broke in Usisnais and the mainstream media Der Yid, the Yiddish newspaper of record for Hasidic followers of Rabbi Zalman Teitelbaum, leaders of the largest Satmar faction in Williamsburg addressed the topic head on. The article, Bike Lanes and Train Lines, framed the issue of bike lanes within the broader context of the Hasidic community's relationship to forms of transportation in Williamsburg and in other neighborhoods around the globe. Moshe Yida Deutsch, the article's author, began by declaring that the problem posed by bike lanes was both spiritual and physical. Spiritual, because the bike lanes were being used by people who wore revealing clothing. Physical, because the lanes created traffic delays and eliminated a great deal of parking, among other problems. On the latter basis alone, Deutsch argued, it would be legitimate to oppose such lanes, even if it had nothing to do with the religious feelings of the residents. In opposing the bike lanes, however, Hasidim had to accept certain realities, according to Deutsch, and to proceed in a way that would minimize clashes with others. First, Deutsch noted, Hasidic critics of the bike lane could no longer accurately claim that the lanes only served people from the outside, that is to say, not residents of Williamsburg, for one simple reason. The regrettable thing is that the definition of Williamsburg resident has, in recent years, taken on an entirely different form, and yes, in the quarter known as Williamsburg live, unfortunately, such people who use bike lanes in their daily lives. Williamsburg was a very different place before it became gentrified, and I suppose that's what he's responding to. Second, Deutsch cited the Talmudic dictum that it is difficult to live in big cities, Babylonian Talmud Ketubot 110b, to indicate that in a metropolis like New York, Hasidim had to expect that they would be exposed to things that did not jibe with their moral code. Finally, Deutsch enjoined his readers to remember that they were still living in exile, albeit a kind that would have been unrecognizable to their ancestors. We Jews must remember, after all, that we are in Gullus, in exile. In former times, people would shut the Jewish population in ghettos, and prima facie, I don't know how you pronounce that, no one would make a bike lane in a walled-in enclosed ghetto for the use of outsiders. Today, people do not live in a ghetto, and the yoke of Gullus is in general lighter than in those darker times. As for what the community could do, Deutsch reminded Hasidim that since they were living in exile, they were not free to exercise control over public places. At the same time, they should not simply take a quietist approach to the problem. Rather, members of the community should demand that their concerns and desires be treated with the same seriousness as those of the citizens who were lobbying for the bike lanes, or as he put it, if the principle of opening bike lanes is to establish citizens to benefit from public streets, and the same principles must also acknowledge the loss that the other part of the citizenry suffers on account of this, and find a way to balance the opposing positions. This political negotiation, moreover, should be conducted by experienced Stadlunim intercessors, representatives of the Hasidic establishment. What is left for us to do is Stadlunas intercession with the hope that, with heaven's help, the community spokesman will succeed in annulling the aforementioned decree. Thus, the course of action implicitly endorsed by Williamsburg Hasidic establishment was to avoid force, lobby behind the scenes, and accept that any outcome was likely to involve some degree of compromise. This is really interesting to me. In the coming months, as tensions built around the bike lanes, Hasidim in Williamsburg overwhelmingly followed this approach. Though a few physical confrontations between bikers and Hasidic drivers were reported in the press, it was unclear whether these were connected with a controversy over the bike lanes or were simply the kind of traffic encounters that occurred daily on streets throughout the city. None of them involved the violent targeting of women deemed immodest, nor were there any reported cases of Hasidim attempting to physically sabotage bicyclists in Williamsburg, unlike some bike lane opponents in other parts of New York City who spread tacks or pulled wires in front of riders. The measured approach, endorsed by Der Yid and embraced by Hasidim in Williamsburg, contrasted dramatically with the growing number of violent assaults perpetrated by Haredi vigilantes in Israel during this period against women and girls perceived to be immodest. For those aware of Satmar's long history of confronting threats in Williamsburg by any means necessary, as Malcolm X put it, the community's restraint regarding the bike lanes was striking and for some disappointing. In general, the Embourgeoisment of the Hasidic community in Williamsburg had made its members less prone to public expressions of violence. As one reader of Vus Nais, which continued to cover the bike lane controversy as it unfolded, unhappily observed regarding this transformation, I live in Flatbush and I oppose these sick bike lanes, especially in from Orthodox areas where the women drive unsneezed immodestly. I'm surprised the Satmars of today are so passive. If they tried bike lanes with women dressed not modest in Meisharim, there would be crushed bikes. I respect the real Jews in Meisharim because they are the real deal, not the materialistic Heimische religious Jews. Yes, assimilated types in Williamsburg. Yet, as other posters to Vus Nais had noted when the story of the bike lanes was first reported, Hasidic Williamsburg was not Meisharim, nor was it the same community that had earned a reputation in the 1970s and 1980s for meeting threats with fists as well as with Stadlanus, with intercessors. First, the Embourgeoisment of the Hasidic community in Williamsburg, driven in part by new real estate wealth generated as a result of gentrification, may have diminished the appetite for direct physical confrontation that characterized the enclave when it was more hardscrabble. Second, the marked increase in media scrutiny of the neighborhood spurred by gentrification, as well as near ubiquitous ability to create videos with smartphones, meant that actions taken by Hasidim that previously would have gone unrecorded were now subject to viral dissemination and could be used in criminal prosecutions and other legal proceedings. This point was especially salient when Hasidim confronted well-organized media savvy outsiders such as pro-bike lane activists. Third, even the most zealous Hasidim may have treated the largely young white middle class people who biked through the neighborhood with kid gloves because they understood that the newcomers possessed a kind of cultural capital that Latinos, African Americans, and even other Hasidim did not have. This capital could readily translate into increased attention and actions by the media, police, and politicians. Finally, unlike the residents of Haredi towns and neighborhoods in Israel, Hasidim in Williamsburg lived in a cosmopolitan city where people of all walks of life mingled daily, and like most New Yorkers, they had learned to basically ignore others whose appearances were radically different or even by their community standards offensive. I like this line. They had learned to basically ignore others whose appearances were radically different or even by their community standards offensive. This is very interesting. This is to the subject of, is it offensive to walk around in immodest clothing? And I definitely think if you're a visitor, you should dress modestly. But it's how this community ends up mingling with people who dress very scantily, especially in the summer. There's kind of a tuning out. Despite the opposition of Hasidic activists in Williamsburg, the city proceeded with its plan to create a two-way bike lane on Kent Avenue at the end of October 2008 and installed signs prohibiting parking or stopping at any time on the street. Within weeks, it became apparent that many non-Hasidic business owners were upset with the bike lanes for their own reasons, including a lack of access to loading docks, difficulty in receiving deliveries, and the elimination of around 500 parking spots, which contributed to a drastic decline in revenue for some businesses. Compared to what the Wall Street Journal later described as the turf war or shtetl feud involving Hasids versus hipsters, or what New York called the clash of the bearded ones, the growing opposition of merchants and other business owners, including some who could have easily been described as hipsters, to the Kent Avenue bike lane received little media attention, and what it did receive was presented factually and non-sensationally. Wow, this was really good. Let's see what the next cover of New Yorker. Clash of the Bearded Ones. Take the L train. Okay. Interesting. Okay. In the coming months, the protracted struggle over the Williamsburg bike lanes became a synecdoche for the narrative of the clash of cultures, as the Brooklyn paper put it, which came to dominate media coverage of the neighborhood. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Daily News, the Atlantic, the Forward, the New York Post, New York, the literary magazine M+, and many Brooklyn-based publications and real estate blogs published pieces on the issue. Eventually, the controversy inspired a documentary film, Hasidics and Hipsters Battle on Bikes, and a play, Division Avenue. With these works, bicyclists served as a stand-in for hipsters, who in turn signified gentrifiers generally. I know how much people were excited by this idea of the Hasids versus the hipsters on bikes. While the clash of cultures narrative accurately reflected some of what was taking place on the ground in Williamsburg and was articulated by at least some of the neighborhood's Hasidic residents, it flattened the differences within demographic groups in Williamsburg while ignoring what at least some members of the different groups had in common. Perhaps most important, one thing that Hasidic opponents and non-Hasidic supporters of the bike lanes in Williamsburg shared was that both groups included well-organized and media-savvy activists skilled at employing direct action to generate publicity and apply political pressure in support of their causes. As one poster on Vus's Nais bluntly put it, bikers are as organized as Hasidim, if not more so. The first move in what became a year-long struggle between activists from both sides of the issue was taken on November 24, 2008, following a fractious transportation town hall organized by two local politicians, Diana Reyna and David Yaski. Isaac Abraham, who was running as a candidate to replace Yaski on the city council, publicly announced a direct action by Hasidic school bus drivers to protest the new no-stopping prohibition on Kent Avenue. We will ask all drivers, when you pick up or drop off our children, put your bus in an angle, block the entire street, wait till the parent gets to the door of the bus, and slowly, very slowly, take your child off or put it on the bus, and don't rush to get back on the sidewalk. One day, the traffic will be backed up all the way to Long Island City, to the Department of Transportation headquarters. Traffic will come to a halt. On December 5, mounting pressure from neighborhood residents and business owners had prompted a number of local politicians, including Raina Yaski and Brooklyn Borough resident Marty Markowitz, to sign a letter requesting that the city modify the design of the Kent Avenue bike lane to restore some of the eliminated parking and allow stopping in certain zones. In response to these developments, Time's Up, which described itself as a grassroots environmental group that uses educational outreach and direct action to promote a more sustainable, less toxic city, issued a press release announcing that on December 17, the organization's bicycle clowns would be riding through the neighborhood to defend the new bike lane and future greenway connector in Williamsburg, and use theater to comically draw attention to the serious danger forced by cyclists without safe, protected bike lanes. And the clowns did ride. A few weeks later, on December 28, Hasidic activists placed a 4x8 detour sign in a warehouse parking lot near the intersection of Kent Avenue and Broadway, the unofficial border of Hasidic Williamsburg. The semi-official looking sign declared in alternating black and white print against an orange background, "Important notice to all drivers from the resident of Kent Avenue. Detour route due to the bike lane and parking problem created by New York City Department of Transportation. We urge all drivers to use White Avenue as your alternative route so you have no delays when the buses are picking up and dropping off kids. The buses will be in an angle blocking the road and the bike lane for safety." 2 days later, on December 30, the sign was removed, but not before it had inspired another attention-grabbing article in the New York Post titled "Hasid Street Fight." Despite its pugnacious-sounding headline, the article noted Hasidic community activist Isaac Abraham said the decision to hang the sign has nothing to do with the battle between the Hasid and the Hadis. However, he says it's about protecting kids from bikers who ignore traffic laws. Hasid and the Hadis, please. Oh my goodness. By this point, Hasidim who commented to the press about the bike lanes invariably stressed that their opposition was due to safety concerns and traffic issues rather than immodesty. As Leo Moskowitz, a Hasidic resident of Schaefer Landing, put it, there are people who are trying to play that the nudity is the issue, but it's not. The main concern is the safety of our kids. There are a lot of institutions and families on that Bedford Avenue stretch, and we are always really concerned about the kids being picked up and dropped off. There are sometimes small accidents where the cyclists are violating the law because they don't stop for flashing school buses. In fact, all these concerns, including ones regarding immodesty, existed in the Hasidic community, as well as plenty of indifference to the bike lane and even some quiet support, but Hasidic activists had learned that publicly complaining about immodesty not only did not help their cause, but also catalyzed the opposition. Isaac Abraham, who had initially expressed concern regarding the bike lane's potential for bringing immodestly dressed riders to the neighborhood, went on to distance himself completely from the issue in the documentary Hasidics and Hipsters, A Battle on Bike Lanes, in which he said there was one stupid moron who's absolutely an imbecile that made a statement in public that the problem is with the dress code of the women. If you look at the guy who said this, he should really be in the zoo. I have no better words for this guy. Instead of complaining about immodest bikers, Hasidic activists had learned that traffic and safety concerns resonated with non-Hasidic critics of bike lanes around the city and also provided a politically palatable justification, some would say cover, for the Department of Transportation to make changes to the biking infrastructure in Williamsburg. Over the next several months, Community Board 1 meetings continued to erupt in heated debate. Then, in the spring of 2009, the Department of Transportation unveiled a new design for the Kent Avenue bike lane that restored loading zones and hundreds of parking spaces. In her retrospective account of the period, Jeanette Tzadikan argued that although the changes may have been inspired by critics, the outcome was actually a victory for bike lane advocates. We expected pushback to the proposal, which also changed Kent from a single traffic lane in both directions to a one-way car traffic street, Tzadikan wrote. But that didn't seem to faze neighborhood opponents when they saw how much parking would be restored. Through community consultation, a street design was negotiated that was more radical than the one it replaced. Had we started by proposing that what we ultimately built on Kent, we would have been tossed from the Williamsburg Bridge. Pushback came half a year later, however, in December 2009, after city workers eliminated the 14-block section of the Bedford Avenue bike lane that ran through Hasidic Williamsburg, sparking cynical speculation that Michael Bloomberg had made a backroom deal with Hasidic power brokers in order to shore up support in the community in advance of the upcoming mayoral election. At the time, New York City officials refused to acknowledge on the record that they had cut a deal with the Hasidic community over bike lanes in Williamsburg. Seth Solomino, a spokesman for the Department of Transportation, described it laconically as part of ongoing bike network adjustments in the area. Writing in 2016, however, Sadiq Khan and Solomino suggested that there had in fact been an understanding, maybe even a downright quid pro quo, that Hasidim would withdraw their opposition to the Kent Avenue bike lane if the city removed the one on Bedford Avenue, which is where I bike and there is not a bike lane. The downside to the Kent Avenue redesign was the controversial erasure of the bike lane on Bedford Avenue. It was hard to explain how this seemingly retreat actually advanced the biking agenda. But with a new Kent Avenue lane, we have the best bike lane in Brooklyn, just a couple of blocks parallel to the one we removed from Bedford. A single action instantly staunched a potentially deep political wound and made possible hundreds of miles of future bike lanes in New York City. And to this day, hundreds of people still bike down Bedford Avenue daily in the blank space where the bike lane used to be, just as it is legal to bike on any other city streets. Stretch pants, short shorts, mini skirts, and all. The elimination of the bike lane on this particular stretch of Bedford Avenue was a goal, arguably the goal, of Hasidic activists from the beginning of the controversy over Kent Avenue, and with good reason. Whereas Kent Avenue ran along the mixed residential and industrial edge of the neighborhood and was bordered on one side by the Brooklyn Navy Yard, Bedford Avenue was one of the Hasidic Williamsburg's two iconic thoroughfares, along with Lee Avenue, lined with brownstones, including the former home of Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum, long-established businesses such as Spitzer's Kosher Bakery, and important Jewish institutions, including the Puppy Yeshiva, whose numerous school buses made frequent stops to drop off and pick up students. Thus, the Bedford Avenue bike lane had considerable symbolic and practical significance, raising concerns among some Hasidic residents about not only immodestly dressed bikers, but also potentially accidents involving pedestrians, especially school children, as well as problems with parking and traffic flow. Bike lanes in Hasidic Williamsburg with Jewish school bus in the background. At the same time, many cyclists valued the Bedford Avenue bike lane precisely because it ran through one of the most scenic streets in the neighborhood rather than a semi-industrial truck route like Kent Avenue, and because it provided direct link to both the Williamsburg Bridge and the main commercial strip of North Williamsburg. Whereas Hasidic activists viewed the elimination of the Bedford Avenue bike lanes as part of a broader compromise involving their acceptance of the redesigned bike lane on Kent Avenue, biking activists took it as a major step backward for both traffic safety and the environment, and a provocation that had to be confronted head-on, which they did in a series of direct action protests. A few days after the Bedford Avenue bike lane was sandblasted, activists who later identified themselves to the press as self-hating Jewish hipsters used the cover of night to repaint the lane and then posted a video of their actions online. On December 13, members of the Time's Up Clown Brigade organized a New Orleans-style funeral procession to commemorate the demise of the bike lane, and a week later, Candy Rain, a porn magazine for women made by women, sponsored a topless freedom ride through South Williamsburg to protest what Heather Loop, its chief organizer, decried as the Hasidic community's intolerance. If you can't handle scantily clad women, live in a place where you can have your own sanctuary like upstate. Although winter weather forced the Freedom Riders to abandon their plans of cycling naked, they remained defiant. Loop declared, "I feel like they're forcing their beliefs on us. It's the Bill of Rights to not force your religion on anybody." Kalisha Jenkin, another participant, urged, "They're essentially moving the bike lane because they don't want to look at girls dressed like sluts, and I want to dress like a slut." Paul Steele-White, the executive director of the nonprofit Transportation Alternatives, opposed the bike lane removal but also criticized the Freedom Ride for being undully confrontational. A bike lane on Bedford Avenue is an issue of transportation and road safety, he said. Rhetoric or acts that pit neighbors against one another are not just irrelevant to this discussion, they are flat out offensive. A bike ride of people in provocative undress doesn't make Bedford Avenue safer and undermines efforts to bring North Brooklynites together to solve this problem. One of the most provocative figures to become involved in the bike lane controversy in Williamsburg was Baruch Hertzfeld, variously portrayed in the media with varying degrees of accuracy as a lapsed Satmar, a neighborhood gadfly clown activist businessman, a classic macher, and motor mouth with a foot in both the Hasidic and hipster worlds, an impish ex-Orthodox bike activist, and a self-appointed liaison between the pro-lane hipsters and an anti-lane Satmar Hasidim. A graduate of Yeshiva University, a modern Orthodox institution located in Upper Manhattan, and the brother of two Orthodox rabbis, Hertzfeld opened and ran the Treif Bikesgeschäft, unkosher bike business, on South 6th Street near Broadway for several years. I remember that. Hertzfeld donated space in the Treif Bikesgeschäft to Time's Up and presented himself as the spokesman for the activists who repainted the Bedford bike lane, though he stated that he had not participated in the action itself. When in December 2009, Mayor Michael Bloomberg attended a climate change conference in Copenhagen, a city so linked to bike-centered urban planning that it inspired the term Copenhagenization to describe the phenomenon, Hertzfeld credulously declared, "How can Mayor Bloomberg go to Copenhagen and pose as a green mayor after this? He's a hypocrite, and I believe his office directed the DAT to remove this bike lane as a political favor to the rabbis who want to keep South Williamsburg a ghetto enclave." In numerous interviews with the press, Hertzfeld argued that there was a gulf between Williamsburg's Hasidic leaders, whom he described as puritanical Talibanoists, and the community's rank and file members, whom he claimed were not only more tolerant of the hipsters' presence in the neighborhood, but also open to bike riding if given the opportunity. To this end, Hertzfeld created a free bike lending program, or Gemach, specifically for local Hasidic residents, and sought to turn the Treif Bikegeschäft into a meeting place for Hasidim and hipsters, one decorated with a Magen David shaped out of adjoining rubber chickens, artistic graffiti, and a Yiddish message reminding Satmar residents to come borrow bicycles. Transportation Alternatives, which had criticized the topless bike protests for being unnecessarily divisive, publicly supported the Treif Bikegeschäft. As Wiley Norvell, a spokesman for the group, told The Forward, "It's definitely the kind of bridge building that North Brooklyn could really use right now. It's been a tough year. There's no doubt about that. This is the sort of thing that could help this is the sort of thing that could help us get back to a much more civil place." Despite their differences, activists representing a variety of camps came together on January 25, 2010 to debate the Bedford Avenue bike lane at Pete's Candy Store, an iconic hipster bar and performance space on North Williamsburg. Moderated by Baruch Hertzfeld, the debate included Caroline Sampanaro from Transportation Alternatives, Heather Loop and Lila Durden of the topless bike protest, and Isaac Abraham, the Hasid whose energetic activism and ultimately failed candidacy for city council had inspired the Brooklyn paper to describe him as the unofficial mayor of South Williamsburg. Abraham and his fellow debaters disagreed on practically everything that night, but the fact that they had all gathered in one spot to discuss the bike lane revealed the degree to which they all belonged to the same activist universe in Williamsburg. That is my reading of this fabulous chapter. I really actually enjoyed it. There's so many layers of research. And thank you for watching. There's much that's happening with the bike lane presently, which is why I did this. And I'm trying to think of a way to do a video to cover what is happening with the bike lane at the moment. Well, thanks for joining me, and check back. Oh, drop a link of other videos or books that you want me to read from, and maybe I'll do that. Bye.